So we're going to talk a little bit about skin color, skin appendages, and skin functions in this lecture. So skin color has three pigments that contribute to it. The first one is melanin. Then we have carotene, not to be confused with keratin, Keratin, which is the protein that gives us strength in our skin and our hair. This is carotene, Carotene, so that's very important. And then hemoglobin. So melanin is the only pigment that we make in our skin, and it's put together using our DNA, because we know that DNA gives us the code to create proteins. And so melanin is a protein. It's just a chain of amino acids that are put together in a particular arrangement based on our genetics. And melanin ranges in color from yellow to reddish brown to black. And all humans have the same number of melanocytes. The differences that we see in races and in individuals is because of the kind of melanin that they make, because once again, it's based on our DNA, as well as the amount of melanin that is made. Now, melanin, some unique things about it. One thing is freckles. When an individual has freckles, those freckles are just where you have an accumulation of melanin in one particular spot. Now, we've already discussed how melanin protects our DNA from UV radiation. Well, when the sun hits the skin, it stimulates melanocytes to produce more melanin and causes that melanin to build up. And what happens is you see a darkening of the skin, and we call that tanning. Tanning is nice, but we need to be aware that tanning and being exposed to UV radiation can lead to some problems with our skin. And one of those things is excessive sun exposure causes our skin to develop these clumped elastin fibers in the connective tissue. And then over time, our skin gets this leathery appearance. So if you want your skin to stay healthy and young looking, the best way to do that is protect it from UV radiation by using sunblock. So carotene is the only pigment that we get from plant products. So plants that have a yellow or orange color to them, like carrots, carry a lot of carotene in them. Well, if we eat a lot of this carotene, it tends to accumulate in our skin, particularly in the stratum corneum, as well as in the hypodermis, but a lot in the stratum corneum. So what happens is when we consume a whole lot of these plants that have carotene, the color will begin to build up in the stratum corneum, and then what happens is you actually give off this yellow orangey look. You see it in individuals who have a very fair complexion. A lot of times babies who eat a lot of carrots as baby food, or eat a lot of like butternut squash, things that have a lot of yellow or orange pigment, you will see that carotene build up in their palms, their soles. And for my son, we saw it across his nose, had kind of a yellow pigment to it. Now, hemoglobin gives our skin a pinkish hue. You don't see hemoglobin a lot in individuals unless they are very fair complected. So if you have a fair complexion, then it's possible that you kind of have a pink hue to your skin. And that's because the hemoglobin is in our red blood cells, and then they circulate through the blood vessels under the epidermis in the dermis, and it gives off that red color. One thing that hemoglobin can be used for is a diagnostic tool. An individual who is experiencing heart failure or respiratory distress, their blood will not be fully oxygenated, which means that it has kind of a purplish tint to it. And in fair-complected individuals, especially fair-complected Caucasians, you will see this blue develop around their lips and their fingertips, and that is a sign of cyanosis. If they're cyanotic, it means they're not getting enough oxygen. So we have some imbalances of the skin based on skin color. One is erythema. This is redness. We tend to kind of flush or get red when we're embarrassed. We have a fever, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, inflammation due to an injury or something that's provoked it within our skin, or an allergy can lead to redness. The exact opposite is pallor, also known as blanching. And it's when your skin goes extremely pale. It's like the blood just drains out of the skin. And that's usually caused by fear, by anger, stress, anemia, or low blood pressure, which is also known as hypotension. I will say that anger is one of the ones that I'm a little bit on the fence about, because typically if I get mad, I turn red. But some individuals, when they get mad, they get pale. So I think that's because my blood pressure goes up, which leads to the reddening. For other people, maybe they just respond to that stress in a different way. The third imbalance is jaundice. Sometimes it's called yellow cast. This is where your skin has a yellow pigment to it, and it's because bile accumulates in the blood and in the body tissue because your liver is not functioning properly. Jaundice is pretty common in babies. A lot of babies are born jaundiced, and so they put them under a light, which helps to break down that bile. We also see jaundice in individuals who are going through liver failure. Then the other two imbalances, number 4 would be bronzing. Bronzing, or this metallic appearance of the skin, is usually a sign of something called Addison's disease. This is an adrenal dysfunction. So you're not breaking down something like you're supposed to, and it can be toxic. And then lastly, we have bruises. And of course, we all know what a bruise is and what happens, what causes a bruise. But what's technically happening is under the epidermis, in the dermis, of a blow to the body, it's caused blood vessels to burst, which lets blood escape, and then it clots up beneath the skin, and we call that a hematoma. And of course, bruises begin as kind of a dark bluish purple color, and then over time, when you see them change colors as they begin to go away, it's because you're watching that blood clot begin to digest. So that leads us to appendages of the skin. So appendages are extra things that we find in the skin, kind of like some of our glands. So we're going to start by talking about sweat glands. So sweat glands are also known as sudoriferous glands. And we have sweat glands all over our body surface except for the nipples and the external genitalia. Each individual has an average of about 2.5 million sweat glands. That's a lot of sweat glands. And we have two types. We have the eccrine and the apocrine. I've seen it pronounced eccrine and apocrine, but I've always just said eccrine and apocrine. So we're going to start with the eccrine sweat glands. In some of my older textbooks, they were called merocrine sweat glands, which is the same thing. And basically, these are the most numerous. We find these a lot on our palms, our feet, and our forehead. These are the ones that are working up whenever we go to hold hands with somebody, maybe like at a church or a school function. They tell everybody to hold hands, and you get stuck holding the hand of somebody who has a really clammy hand. That's their eccrine sweat glands. It consists of a simple single coiled tube that then opens up as a funnel at the skin in a pore. When we sweat about 99% of it is water, but that 1% is mixed with some acid, some salt, some vitamins, antibodies, metabolic waste, some things that we break down. And then the one that's down here in South Mississippi that gives us trouble is lactic acid. So lactic acid, when we secrete it attracts mosquitoes. So if you're ever sitting outside and you're just getting eaten up by mosquitoes, it's because your lactic acid is attracting them. That's why we tend to use insect repellent, which masks the smell of the lactic acid, so the mosquitoes don't know we're there and they just fly right on by. The point of having eccrine sweat glands is to prevent overheating, but these particular sweat glands are also tied to extreme emotional stress. Whenever you get stressed out or worried, sometimes you'll break out in what's known as a cold sweat across your forehead, your hands, and that's because you're under extreme emotional stress. Now, apocrine sweat glands, these are found in the axillary, which is your armpits, and the anogenital areas. And they secrete their product into hair follicles. And so they secrete the same stuff that we see in the eccrine sweat glands. The difference is they also add in these fatty substances and proteins. And so the secretion itself can actually have a color to it. It can be kind of a milky yellow color. Sometimes if you wear like a white shirt, they can stain the armpits of your shirt, and it's because that oily substance, that fatty substance, will begin to color the material that color. The sweat gland secretion is odorless, but when it decomposes on the skin, the decomposition leads to a very unpleasant odor that we know of as BO, or body odor. Apocrine sweat glands don't begin to function until we hit puberty. And then once we hit puberty, we typically are going to use something like a deodorant, which masks the smell of that decomposition of their secretion. Or you may opt to use an antiperspirant, which keeps you from sweating. So therefore, you don't have that sweat come out, so it can't decompose to cause that odor. Another gland, and this is actually a modified apocrine sweat gland, but it's found in the ear canal. It's called the ceruminous gland, and the ceruminous gland produces a very sticky substance that we know as cerumen. And cerumen is known to us as earwax. And of course, it has its purposes. Earwax helps to collect things that may be getting down into our ear canal and protecting them. The mammary glands are also another specialized sweat gland that secretes milk. Women, when they give birth to their child, within just a matter of minutes, their mammary glands begin to function, and they will produce milk until the child quits nursing, and then they will almost go dormant until it's time to be used again. So then we have sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are known as oil glands to us, and we have them all over the body except for the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. And they secrete an oily substance that's known as sebum. These fats will begin to accumulate in the cell until it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and finally the little cell will burst, and that sebum will ooze out onto the hair follicle or a pore on the skin. Now, sebum's job is to soften and lubricate our hair and skin. It also keeps it from losing too much water, and just a kind of a side note, it helps to kill bacteria. Sebaceous glands tend to give us more trouble, though, than eccrine sweat glands or apocrine sweat glands do, because sebaceous glands, when they get blocked, they will form a whitehead, and then if that inside the whitehead dries and oxidizes, it becomes a blackhead. Also, if your oil glands are extremely active and they become inflamed, they will cause a disorder that's known as acne, which is usually a bacterial infection of your sebaceous glands, and it has to be treated by a dermatologist who might put you on some type of antibacterial face wash. Lastly, we have seborrhea. Seborrhea is known as cradle cap. Cradle cap is what babies get after they're born. Their oil glands continue to secrete oil, and eventually they'll level off, but for a little while they produce more oil than what's needed, and it forms these little scaly patches on their scalp, sometimes their eyebrows, and even down onto like their back. They'll get these little lesions of just like patchy, dry looking stuff that will flake off. If it's bad enough, a doctor will tell you to wash your child's hair or head or body using a dandruff shampoo. So let's talk about hair and hair follicles, because these are also appendages. Believe it or not, evolutionary biologists have studied and determined that hair, the main purpose of it is to sense insects. And if you think about it, a mosquito crawls across your hand or your arm. You feel it in your hair before you notice it that it's sitting there, because it's not going to be heavy enough. Also, it's been determined that the hair on your scalp helps you against head trauma, but it also, the big thing is it helps to reduce your amount of heat loss. So like during the winter, it's important that we cover our head because we lose a large percentage of our body heat through our head. And then also our hair protects our scalp from sunlight. Our eyes have the eyelashes, which help to protect our eyes. If something gets close to them, our eyelashes trigger our eyes to blink. And then, of course, they collect things like dust and sweat and stuff like that. Nose hairs filter the air that we breathe in. So the hair is known as a pili, and it's made of very hard keratin, and that allows it to be very tough so that it doesn't break as easily. Our hair color is made at the base of the hair follicle, deep in the root. That's why when an individual gets their hair colored, shortly after, well, not shortly after, but after they've allowed it to grow a little bit, you'll begin to see their roots showing. The roots are their actual hair color. Parts of the hair include the shaft, which is what we brush every day and we style. And then the part that's down in our skin is known as the root. The hair itself is made of 3 layers. We have the medulla, which is the central core. Then around it is the cortex. But the most important or most interesting to me is the cuticle. The cuticle is like shingles that overlap on top of our hair. And when we do things like straighten our hair, we actually push that cuticle down. We iron it down so that our hair is straight. When you use shampoos that add body, it causes those cuticles to stand out, almost like shingles being blown up on a roof, and that gives your hair body or more volume. So we manipulate the cuticle to make our hair do what we want to so that we can style it or it has the texture that we would like. Hair follicles extend down into the dermis, and at the base of the hair follicle, you'll find the hair bulb. It's like a little piece of tissue, and around it is a little root hair plexus, which is like a nerve ending, so that when you pull on your hair, it hurts. And if you're tender-headed, that just means you have very sensitive nerve endings in your hair. And then finally, we have nails. Nails are actually modified epidermis. It's like a scale that is formed with a lot of keratin. We use our nails as tools to pick up things and to scratch things. Our nail has a free edge. That's the part we scratch with. The body is what we think of when we paint it. And then the proximal root is what runs under the skin and holds our nail onto our finger. Under the nail, you have your epidermis, and it causes your nail to look pink because there's lots of capillaries in there. And then every now and then, someone will have what's known as lanula. Lanula is this little half moon right here. I have it on a couple of my fingers, but not every one of my fingers. And so that's it for the appendages. So let's move on to functions, and we'll be wrapping up. So the functions of the integumentary system include protection. So one way that our skin protects us is through chemical barriers. Chemical barriers are going to be chemicals that aid in the protection of our skin or our body. And so things like secretions, melanin, those are chemicals that help to protect the body. Low pH that's secreted makes it unfavorable for bacteria. So that's one way we're protected. We produce a natural antibiotic known as human defensin, and that's something that will destroy bacteria that may land on our skin. And then finally, we know that we get protection from the chemical melanin to protect us against UV light. Of course, our skin is a physical barrier too, though. It's hard, it's continuous, and it only allows certain substances to pass through, like lipid-soluble substances can come through the skin. Oleoresins, which are made by plants. If you're allergic to poison ivy, it's because that oleoresin can easily pass into your skin, and then you have an allergic reaction or inflammatory response. Organic solvents like acetone can pass through our skin. Salts of heavy metals like mercury and lead, things like that. And then some drugs, remember we talked about at the very beginning how a lot of pharmaceutical companies are trying to figure out ways that we can send medicine through the skin rather than having to have a shot or take a lot of pills. And then finally, we also provide biological barriers by our skin. So the Langerhans cells and the macrophages, those are just different cells in the body whose job it is to aid in the immune response if something breaches our physical barrier. Our skin also functions as a body temperature regulator. Our body just works best when it's 98.6 degrees. If we get too hot, we'll secrete more sweat. If we get too cool, then our body has a way of stopping the sweat production and then has a mechanism for keeping the heat in. Believe it or not, you can lose up to 12 liters of sweat a day. And the reason why is if you're overheating, your body will put more sweat to cool down your body. Cool temperatures are really cold temperatures. When you step outside, you may feel like your face gets really tight. And that's because the blood vessels in your dermis constrict, and that keeps the blood towards the inside of the body and keeps your core temperature up, not allowing that heat to escape through the skin. Also, our skin is responsible for cutaneous sensations. So we have little receptors throughout the body that allows us to respond to stimuli when we come in contact with it. We also help with metabolism through our skin. So sunlight, of course, modifies cholesterol to vitamin D. And if we don't have vitamin D, we can't absorb calcium into our bones. So this is a very important function that our skin does to help us have a healthy skeleton. And then also our skin serves as a blood reservoir. We have a large dermal vascular supply, holds a lot of blood for the body. So it just kind of serves as a place for blood to be able to go and hang out and that we can draw on as needed. And then excretion. Our body excretes a lot of waste through our skin, and that's through sweating. So nitrogen-containing waste will be eliminated through our sweat. And we're going to stop right here. Our next discussion will be on homeostatic imbalances like cancer and burns. So I would suggest at this point that you make sure that you have read through the text and that you're very familiar with the notes that we've done so far, because the next few notes are not many, and you have the bulk of the information that you need for your next test. If you have any questions, please let me know.